Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Сегодня у нас очень важный гость из Бразилии, господин профессор Баррозо, является председателем Высшего избирательного суда Бразилии. Он доктор наук, профессор, выпускник Ельского университета, выпускник Гарвардского университета. Ну, в общем, человек, обремененный огромным количеством научных регалий и достижений. И сегодня, с учетом того, что он пребывает в нашей стране в качестве наблюдателя за проходящими выборами в Государственную Думу Федерального собрания Российской Федерации, то сегодня нам удалось вот его уговорить, чтобы он приехал на короткую встречу с научным коллективом и студенческим коллективом дипломатической академии. Поэтому сейчас я с большим удовольствием передам слово господину Баррозо. Я понял. Я прошу прощения. Регламент у нас будет такой: 15 минут господин Баррозо выступит с небольшим докладом, а потом мы будем задавать вам вопросы. Пожалуйста.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to thank Dr. Oleg Karpovich and Andrei Danelian for the invitation and for me to share some thoughts and some ideas on this subject, democracy under pressure. As you might know, I'm from Brazil. I'm a Supreme Court Justice in Brazil, and I'm visiting here. But I'll try to treat this subject, democracy under pressure, under a more general perspective and not only a Brazilian or a Latin American perspective. So I would like to talk a little bit about the recent past of democracy and then the current situation of democracies in the world and the reason why I say democracy is under pressure. Just to make sure we are talking the same language, I'm going to make a very short introduction with some conceptual notions. So the concept of democracy, of constitutional democracy, we're going to be working here is the following. Constitutional democracy is an institutional arrangement that merges two ideas that have run different trajectories: constitutionalism and democracy. Constitutionalism is a heir to the liberal revolutions, and it basically means that power is limited by law, mostly by a constitution, and in the second place, constitutionalism means respect for fundamental rights. That's constitutionalism. That started with the liberal revolutions. Democracy is something different. Democracy means popular sovereignty, means the rule of majority. And we only have democracy in the world when the 20th century was already advanced, because you can only talk about democracy after you have universal suffrage, meaning no restrictions of political participation due to wealth, race, gender, or level of education. So at some point in the 20th century, these two ideas merge, creating this idea we have today of constitutional democracy. One other feature of constitutional democracies is the existence of a Supreme Court or a constitutional court. And the main reason for that is because between democracy and constitutionalism, there might be tensions, because sometimes the will of the majority, which is the characteristic of democracies, might go against the rules of democracy or the fundamental rights of people. So when this happens, when there is a tension between majoritarian politics and fundamental rights, you need a court to arbitrate this tension, and that is the Supreme Court. So this is the basic concept we're going to be working here. Constitutional democracy means popular sovereignty, rule of the majority, rule of the law, and respect for fundamental rights, usually with a Supreme Court or a constitutional court that will arbitrate the tensions between democracy and constitutionalism. That's our conceptual introduction. So now we talk a little bit about the recent past of democracy. And I would like to say that democracy, or constitutional democracy, I know that each country has its own history, but generally, constitutional democracy was the prevailing ideology of the 20th century, having defeated the alternatives that presented themselves: communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. So, at the end of the 20th century, several waves of democratization had swept the world. After the Second World War, Germany, Italy, and Japan, in the 70s, became democracies. Portugal, Spain, Greece. In the 80s, all countries, most countries in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay. In the 90s, most countries in Central and Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which were quite well familiar. And in South Africa, the end of the apartheid also brought a constitutional wave in South Africa. So when this 20th century ends and the 21st century begins, around 120 countries in the world could be labeled as democratic countries, according to Freedom House. So that's the reason why I said that constitutional democracy had been the victorious ideology of the 20th century. So now we talk a little bit about what's going on in the world right now. And although democracy had been the winning ideology of the 20th century, there seems to be something not going so well these days in different parts of the world. And authors in constitutional law, I'm a constitutional law professor and political scientist, label this moment the world is going through as constitutional recession, constitutional retrogression, illiberal democracies, abusive constitutionalism, or autocratic legalism. Those are different words or expressions to identify this specific moment the world is going through. And the examples of what I am describing have multiplied throughout the years. Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Georgia, Ukraine, the Philippines, Nicaragua in Latin America, Venezuela, and more recently El Salvador. Countries that took this strange path of illiberal democracies. The main characteristic of this scenario is that, unlike what occurred in the past, that the erosion of democracy would come out of coup d'etat, out of movements led by generals, by military and their soldiers. In the current world, democratic erosion has been conducted by political leaders that were elected by popular vote, prime ministers and presidents that were elected. And after being elected, brick by brick, they deconstruct the pillars of democracy, playing the game by a playbook that is almost a universal pattern, which are concentration of powers in the executive branch, the weakening of civil society organizations, persecution of opposition leaders, demonization of the press, changes in the constitution with abuse of powers by the majorities, and packing the Supreme Courts with submissive judges, with submissive justices. That's the path that has been followed in different parts of the world, as I see it from my standpoint, which is basically Brazil and Rio de Janeiro, where I live and work, and Cambridge at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I'm a fellow, senior fellow. So these are my 2 points of observation of the world. So what would be exactly this scenario and its causes? I think there are 3 phenomena going on in the world at the same time, 3 different phenomena. But when they merge, they generate this distortion that I've called illiberal democracy. These 3 phenomena are populism, extremism, and authoritarianism. And so I'd like to say a brief word about each one of them. Populism takes place usually when a charismatic leader is elected, presenting him or herself, could be, as different from everything that's out there, and promising easy solution for difficult problems, easy and usually wrong solutions. Populism is usually the manipulation of the needs and the fears of the populations. And since populism usually doesn't work, populism needs to find someone or some institution to blame for its failures, for its setbacks. And populism usually uses 3 strategies, one can say. The first one is populist leaders try to establish a direct communication with the masses. And in this era of social media, a direct communication with his or her supporters. In the second place, because of that, they try to bypass and weaken what we call the intermediate institutions, like the legislature, the press, the university, or civil society more generally. And in the third place, most countries that fell into populism see attacks against the Supreme Court or the constitutional courts, because the role of these courts is precisely to limit power. A constitution exists to institutionalize and to limit power. So a Supreme Court or a constitutional court has as its main role to interpret the Constitution, which means to limit power. So this is populism and its strategies. Extremism can be on the left or on the right. More recently, we have conservative extremism, and extremism is different than being conservative. Extremism mean intolerance and aggressiveness against whoever is different. It's the denial of rights and of acceptance to whoever thinks differently. And then we fall into this third element I would like to mention, third phenomenon, which is authoritarianism, which is a permanent temptation in many parts of the world, including my continent, Latin America, parts of Asia, parts of Europe, parts of Africa. And there is one thing that kind of singles out this authoritarian conservatism in the current world, which is the use of the social media with hate speech, disinformation campaigns, and conspiratory or conspiracy theories. So these are the tools that authoritarian conservatism has been using in the recent world. Good examples in the United States was the invasion of the Capitol that you certainly have heard, or in Brazil, many people claiming for the closure of Congress and the Supreme Court. So this is an anti-democratic behavior. And finally, so that we have time to talk a little bit, what would be the causes? And I identify three causes for that. First cause is a political cause. In most parts of the world, I just arrived here, so I still don't have the feeling how Russians feel, but in most part of the world, people are not happy with their electoral systems. Electoral systems don't give, in most part of the world, voice and relevance to citizenship. And so this brings a sort of dissatisfaction that make people an easy prey for populist authoritarian discourses. The second reason for this moment of populism and conservatism and authoritarianism is a set of economic and social causes, which involves in many countries unemployment, and in other countries what I would call social stagnation, people that don't have any major perspective of progress, of economic progress in this world of globalization and the knowledge economy that has changed the role of and the importance of professions in the world. When I was younger, and Oleg and younger, the most valuable companies in the world were the companies that were into the oil business, like Exxon and Shell, or car makers like Ford and General Motors, or manufacturer of equipments like General Electric. Well, none of them are on the list anymore. The most valuable companies these days are Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. These are companies that don't produce things, material things. They produce knowledge, data, information. So there is a major change, and a lot of people was left behind outside of this new world, and they resent this, and they are also an easy prey of populism. And lastly, what I would call a cultural identity cause. And that's very interesting, and many people don't pay attention to this. Many people do not profess this cosmopolitan, multicultural, egalitarian creed that fostered progressive thinking in the world. The causes for human rights, for feminism, for racial equality, for gay rights, for environmental protection, for protection of native populations. Many people felt that they lost their power and their hegemony in this progressive world. and the progressive camp, I think, was not able to convince people that these are not progressive causes. These are the causes of humanity, treating everyone equally and with decency. So I think these are the causes that have led democracy to this critical moment it's going through right now. I think these are some ideas to start the debate. I think democracy has internal enemies like inequality, extreme poverty, the appropriation of the state by extractivist elites, and a sense of non-belonging that comes from people that are left behind. But these are issues we can discuss. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I will be delighted to hear any question or any comment anyone wants to make.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Barroso, for your brilliant speech on democracy and all this stuff just with this regard. And I actually would like to ask you first question. My question is quite simple. I would like to ask you, what is the best medicine to keep democracy in any country of the world? Do you have any recipe how to do this? Thank you.
It's hard to say that there is a method because countries have different histories, different problems, different challenges. So to protect or to develop democracy in Latin America, of course, is totally different than to start building democracy in Afghanistan. So you have different routes that you want to go. But I think we could say probably three things, I would say, that we need. Institutions. There's no democracy without institutions, which means different institutions, like branches of government are important institutions, an independent judiciary, a free press, and I would add strong institutions, free and independent press, and a mobilized civil society. I think these would be three pillars that are indispensable for democracy. To build institutions, which might take time, to have a free press, which is a cultural transformation in many parts of the world, and a mobilized civil society. People need to have this impulse of creating an environment of participation and tolerance, including tolerance to alternation in power. Democracy is not the regime that I win always. It's the regime that if I lose today, I still keep my fundamental rights and I can try again in the next elections. So institutions, free press, and mobilized civil society, I think would be necessary ingredients to create or to preserve democracy. All my idea. Thank you much.
Thank you much. Я прошу прощения, господа уважаемые студенты. Кто-то хочет на португальском задать вопрос уважаемому гостю нашему? Да, пожалуйста. Представьтесь только, пожалуйста. Подойдите к микрофону и представьтесь.
Bom dia. Obrigada por a sua informação. Foi muito útil. Chamo-me Bendarenka Maria, sou estudante do segundo ano da Academia Diplomática e tenho uma pergunta. Que métodos são adaptados no Brasil para reduzir o número de pessoas doentes de coronavírus? In English, what methods are adopted in Brazil to reduce the number of sick people of coronavirus? Obrigada.
Reduce the number of? Sick people from coronavirus. Oh, okay. Well, is this a private meeting or not? It's private. Well, Brazil had a major problem. Did you say your name was Ana Maria?
Only
Maria. Okay, Maria. We had a major problem, which was a leadership and a president in total denial of the pandemic and minimizing its consequences from the outset. And until today, he has not dealt with the pandemic with the seriousness it should have been dealt. And what happened in Brazil, Maria, was that the court, the Supreme Court that I belong to, had to play a main role in determining the measures to fight the pandemic, from a health plan, sanitary plan, to compulsory vaccination, to prohibition of campaigns calling people to go back to work at the peak of the pandemic when people should stay at home and social distancing. So what happened in Brazil was, and this is a private meeting, a very mistaken conduction of the pandemic from the beginning, with total denial of its implications, which made the court, the Supreme Court, play a much more important role than it was expected, but it was necessary, and I think we saved many thousand, dozens of thousands of lives by interfering in the process. So I would say a sound health public policy acknowledging the importance of the pandemic would have saved many lives. I spoke with a very acclaimed doctor familiar with the pandemic, and he said if we had adopted the proper measures from the beginning, we could have reduced in 60% the toll of deaths in Brazil, which is now around 600,000 deaths, which is quite a lot. I think we are the second. It's a negative record, but I think only the US has more deaths than Brazil. So it was very poorly conducted, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Кто-то, пожалуйста, желающий?
Thank you. First of all, thanks again, Professor, for your very interesting speech, so rich in thoughts. In your introductory words, you spoke about the role of the justice. I mean, that the sort of arbiter between the phenomenon of democracy and the phenomenon of constitutionalism. My question is, what are, in your opinion, the factors which could and should guarantee the political neutrality of justice in such cases? I mean, of some sort of collision between these two phenomena. Thank you.
That's a very interesting and tough question about the neutrality of the judiciary, especially the neutrality of the Supreme Courts or constitutional courts. Because although the logic by which a Supreme Court decides cases might be legal, might be juridical, but the implications are always politics, because the Constitution, as I said before, is a means to limit politics, to institutionalize politics. Thus, the role of a constitutional court will always be forcing the frontier between politics and law. The ways you have to try to preserve courts from being contaminated by politics is by granting the judges guarantees, personal guarantees of stability, and the fact that law has its own concepts, its own limits, and professionals that work with law usually have to abide by these limits. That being said, and being a constitutional judge for over 8 years now, I can say that although we interpret the Constitution, there is a lot of personal view that you cannot avoid, because everyone has an ideology. I'm not meaning to be more left-wing or more right-wing. I mean, we all have an idea of the good, of the right, of what is legitimate. And of course, we project this in our activity, in our decisions. So, so the answer is there's no neutrality in life. I think that's the answer. That being said, though, there are proper limits that if you trespass, you're not doing law, you're doing politics. So I answer this tough question by saying there's no neutrality in judging, but there are limits in what you can do. So it's, let's imagine a canvas where you can paint. Sometimes it's a big canvas, but still the canvas is the limit. You can't go outside and paint the wall. So this is the answer I can give you, improvising. French like to say, l'art d'improviser, c'est n'improviser jamais. So a tough question like that, he should have warned me before so that I would be prepared to answer.
Thank you very much for your very, very interesting answer. So, anybody else wants to ask a question? Yeah, please.
Me?
Yeah.
Professor Barroso, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. It was very clear and we had a great pleasure to listen to you. My name is Daria. I'm a research associate at the Diplomatic Academy. And I think my question is about Brazil. How do you estimate the situation with democracy in your country? You mentioned about the 3 pillars of democracy, the institutions, the free press, and the mobile civil society. So, in your opinion, concerning these institutions, what is the prospect of democracy in the nearest future in Brazil? Thank you.
Well, I like this. We do have free press and very critical press. It's our president right now has 100% of negative press at this moment. So this first pillar is working. Civil society is fairly mobilized, although the president has around 25% of strong support. But the power of the institutions, the stability of the institution, has been under attack in I would say, the past couple of years. And many people with some support by officers that should not support something like that, asked for the closing of the Supreme Court and the closing of Congress. So institutions have been under attack. Crowds have marched against the Supreme Court and against Congress, many times with the support of the president. More recently, he has backed off. Many people claim for his impeachment, but we are undergoing a tension in Brazil that I thought we had left behind. We have 33 years of democracy to be completed next month. with the 1988 Constitution. And I tend to think that we have a fairly solid democracy that is being strongly tested in the past couple years. And I think we have been resilient, and I think we will get to the next elections without any breach of constitutional legality. But it's very scary that a high percentage of people claim for the return of military regime and for the closing of the Supreme Court and Congress. And the main reason for the dissatisfaction of this group with the court is because we have interfered in the pandemic very strongly and striking down some measures of that are clearly unconstitutional. And the court has a very progressive view in women's rights, in gays' rights, in indigenous people's rights, and in affirmative action. And that confronts some ways of thinking that don't like this agenda, a very conservative, more than conservative, a far-right agenda that is very uncomfortable with the position of the court. But we have been resisting so far, and I think we have the majority on our side. The last polls show that the support for the president has decreased substantially in the past years. I'm not talking about politics. I never talk about politics. I'm talking about institutions and how to protect them, and I'm talking about facts, not opinions. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, the last question, because our guest is very busy today, and that's why, yeah, the last question, please.
I'm very happy to be here.
Senhor Barroso, muito obrigado pela sua muito interessante apresentação. I'm a specialist on artificial intelligence, malicious use of artificial intelligence. That's why for me it's very interesting to know, through many of your talks, as I see, you mentioned the threats coming from the malicious use of artificial intelligence, like deep fakes, for example, technologies to the democracy. How to solve this problem? Your point of view. Thanks in advance for your answer.
Thank you for your question. Well, as you all know, we are living now the third industrial revolution, which is the technological revolution. We had the first one, whose symbol is probably the steam, the second one, whose symbol was electricity, and now the third one, whose symbol is the internet and the personal computers that we all have. And now we are in the verge of the fourth industrial revolution that involves a fusion between information technology, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, I'm not a specialist, but a curious, it's a new world that's opening ahead of us with many promises of good things and many threats, many risks, many dangers. As biotechnology and genetic engineering, you can cure diseases, which is great, but you can create Superman, which is very dangerous for the human condition as we know it. So, and in artificial intelligence, please correct me if I am wrong, so far, the machines, they don't have their own intelligence, conscious. They are fed with information that man will convey. So this is the first risk of artificial intelligence, that the machines will be fed with biased or improper information. And that's one danger that we are going to reproduce in the world of artificial intelligence, the prejudices and biases that we have. And so we are going to perpetuate injustice. So that's one problem. That's one risk. The second risk, it's called singularity, which is the fear that someday the machines will develop their own conscience. And then we are in trouble because they can process much more information than we can. And they're going to be much better than we are. So it's going to be a matter of who controls who. Today we control the machines, but if they develop conscience, they will control us. We don't want to lose this power. So singularity, so prejudice is one problem. Singularity is another problem. And there is one problem that was pointed out by an author called, you probably have read or heard of him, Yuval Noah Harari. And he has this very interesting insight, which is the following. He said, it's kind of a joke, but it's interesting. He said, if a young lady or a young man has two pretenders, two people that are interested in them, and he or she has to decide which one she or he will marry. And then he says, Google, with the information it has on him and on the two candidates, probably can make a better decision than the person, him or herself. So if that's true, and this is a joke, but in other areas of life, some of the decisions we need to take might be more accurately taken by a machine than by ourselves. And that will question the basic idea of our lives and of democracy, which is free will. We decide what we want to do. We have self-determination. The day that the most important decisions regarding our lives are taken heteronomously, outside of us, this pillar of our liberal society will have been destroyed. So this is another risk, or at least it will implicate a major change in the way we live. So again, improvising, these are three risks that I can imagine. First one is bias created by or reproduced by artificial intelligence. Singularity, meaning the fear that they might take over. And in the third place, the fact that the machines will be more important to our own decisions than ourselves, which will be a major change in the world. I think these are some concerns I could share, and I was frightened just to describe them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barroso. I would like to thank you for your coming to our academy today. And on behalf of our academy, we would like to tell you that we will be happy to see you once again someday.
Thank you.
Our doors are open, and we do hope to see you someday once again. And I would like to start some pleasant part of your visit to our academy. Okay. So we have some.
Can I just say something closing?
Yeah.
Yes. I even wrote this down because I thought it was important. Democracy is not a dated conquest, but a continuous process. Even consolidated democracies, as was the case of the United States, are under the risk of setbacks. So that's the first thing. Democracy is something that we need to fight for every day. Second, there are three ideas. There's no miraculous formula to preserve it, but as I said before, strong institutions, free and independent press, and mobilized citizenships are usually decisive. But third, and lastly, and this is what I would like to tell you. The way I deal with these risks and with the fact that we don't win always, I try to play my part the best I can, even when others are not. That's the best thing we can do to change the world. Play well our own parts, even if the others are not doing it. That's my message.